is so great to have you with us, Maya, and I'm excited to introduce you. My name is Neda Shaheen. I'm the other co-chair of the SWANA working group. It's great to be here with my co-chair, Christina, and Layla, who's another member of our leadership team. Maya is the executive director of the Arab American Institute, AAI, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan civil rights organization. It was founded in 1985 to nurture and encourage direct participation in our political and civil life, to mobilize a strong, educated, and empowered Arab American community. In 1996, she established AAI's first government relations department, which she led for 5 years before becoming the legislative director for House Minority Whip David Bonnier, where she managed the congressman's legislative strategy and developed policies on international relations, human rights, immigration, civil rights, and civil liberties and trade. She has a deep knowledge of policymaking, and Maya has also helped expand AAI's work on combating hate crimes, on protecting the rights of securitized communities, and of strengthening our democracy. I am so excited to have you here, Maya, especially because I've known you now for a couple of years, and actually AAI was one of the reasons I got involved in this political world. So you're an inspiration to me. I know you're an inspiration to so many other young Arab American women, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you to you, Neda. Thank you, Christina. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to just hang out and have a conversation about something as important as voting in general, and voting specifically of what I believe to be a really important key constituency, and that is Arab Americans. So for that, I'm grateful, and to hang out with women is always particularly awesome. So I would start, I think what would be great is really a conversation. So I'm just going to go through some really quick observations, and then I'd love for us to just sort of talk through these things. Arab Americans, the roughly 3.7 million of us across the country, are found in every single state of the union. We just have this incredible advantage when it comes to political empowerment, and that is we happen to be concentrated in 12 key states, several of which play a key role in American politics, particularly presidential elections each year. Each 4 years. So it is often discussed that, the pathway to the White House includes Michigan, it includes Ohio, it includes Florida, it includes these key states, Virginia less so, then becoming less of a key swing state. So Arab Americans in those top 12 key states where we happen to be concentrated have several of them that play a really important electoral role. And it amplifies our vote, so to speak. Add the fact that Arab Americans tend to vote at higher percentages than your average American voter, and you really have the impact of the vote amplified in a very important way. So I always start by kind of laying that piece of it out. In some specific states, and we can talk about why gathering numbers about our community is particularly difficult, but we are at least 5% of the vote in the state of Michigan. We're roughly 2% of the vote in Pennsylvania and Ohio. When you consider that the margin of victory in 2016 was less than 11,000 votes in the state of Michigan, that 5% was clearly influential in the outcome of that state. Obviously, with 150,000 votes this time around, that's less so, but they're still really significant in terms of the impact. The wonderful thing about this 2020 election, and it's an odd sentence to say the wonderful thing about 2020 in reference to anything at all, is that we really did see an extraordinary level of engagement from our community. And I think that that's not unusual in terms of what we saw across the country from all voters. It has been a difficult year for so many reasons. And I want to be clear that we are a nonpartisan institution, not bipartisan, nonpartisan. We don't do either of the parties. Yalla Vote, which is our voter engagement program, was launched specifically in 1998. Initially, it was launched just as a GOTV program. So we would come into local communities about 3 months out and say, it's time to get out the vote. And we would work hard, and that's great. And then we'd leave, and folks were like, you guys are great, but I really wish you wouldn't just show up the day before. What can you be doing more in terms of engagement? So over the years, it switched from being GOTV to an integrated voter engagement program, which means that we tend to operate in those communities year round, and it's very much issue driven. Our community, not surprisingly, cares deeply about a variety of issues, and that tends to be a huge motivator for how they involve themselves and how they vote and how they turn out. Yellow Vote itself is nonpartisan, and it is all about making sure this constituency is well organized and heard. So when we talk about courting the Arab American vote, it really is an important development in our political trajectory. And I say that to you because Netta mentioned we were established back in 1985 as an organization. We were established specifically because Arab Americans faced a very real barrier to our political engagement. Two of our co-founders published a paper that if you ever get a job here at the Institute, I give it to you on your first day of employment so that you understand. It is called The Politics of Exclusion. They coined that term. And what it meant is that, like, every constituency that involves itself in the political process, you have to organize for your seat at the table. That's great. This community had to do that. And on top of that, regrettably saw a zero-sum approach to our political engagement, which was that our advocacy on the issue, particularly of Palestinian human rights, meant that our involvement in the political process was often not welcome. We had situations where candidates returned Arab American contributions deemed as quote unquote Arab money. It didn't even get to be Arab American. It was Arab, and it was existentially different and otherized, and our engagement was not welcome. So we've come a long way. And I want to be clear on this point. People, when I talk about that, people assume that I'm talking about sort of these fringe candidates who perhaps, dabbled in bigotry, and I'm talking about presidential candidates. Mondale returned Arab American money. So it wasn't just a small problem, it was a pretty significant one. So we've come a long way from that period to now in this presidential election, where not only did you see our vote being courted in all of these key states that I mentioned, our engagement as a community, as an organized community, generated a position paper that was issued by one of the presidential candidates that highlighted very specific concerns of Arab American voters. That's an important development to be talked about. So specifically, we saw Arab American involvement in this election cycle on every level that you can imagine, from running for office on the state, local, and federal level, to volunteering for campaigns, to being surrogates for those campaigns, to running phone banks, to volunteering when there was a massive call put out for people to assist as poll workers. It really was something to be exceptionally proud of in terms of how our community showed up to participate in this process. I want to close out with just some sort of data, a little bit of data about the Arab American vote to kind of understand it. I'll put it in the context of a lot of misunderstandings about Arab Americans in general tend to take place. We have a massive undercount in terms of our numbers in the US Census. The Census Bureau acknowledges that as a problem. We have been working on getting a new category added to the census for Middle East and North Africa, a geographical ethnic category that would allow us to gather more accurate data about our community. We were very close this time around. It didn't happen, regrettably, because of the highly politicized process by which this administration approached the general decennial census across the board. But based on a combination of census data, immigration data, and other information, we estimate 3.7 million Arab Americans across the country. The majority of them are actually Christian, and a plurality of American Muslims in this country are Black. So the conflation that often takes place is one thing to sort of consider. The other one that I'd like to point out is that while we have areas that are concentrated enough for us to tell a really important Arab American story, I, for example, am from Dearborn. I was born overseas, but my family moved to the United States and set up shop in Dearborn, Michigan. So I love Dearborn, Michigan. It is home. It is incredible. I challenge anyone to have better food than us. I don't think you'll succeed. But what I can't do is ever talk about voters in Dearborn, Michigan, and suggest that they provide a snapshot of anything other than voters in Dearborn, Michigan. I could say the same thing about Orange County, California. I can say the same thing about Patterson, New Jersey. These are interesting stories that these individual communities tell, but they're not reflective of the broader Arab American vote nationally. And I think we can talk more about that as we move along. But to share, we have what we call our Yellow Vote tracking poll that we've been doing since the mid-1990s. It is a national poll, so it's again different than these sort of micro examples. And I can start with the first one I want to highlight is party ID, if you don't mind, Netta. So not surprising. The poll this time around showed a pretty significant. I'm sorry, this one's not party ID, Netta, but we can go in a different. There you go. The last one's party ID. Thank you. A pretty significant percentage of higher percentage of support for Biden, although I would point out to you that Trump increased in support from the 2016 numbers. But what I think is we can spend all day on a poll, and I just wanted to highlight just a few things on this one. Specifically, Arab Americans as a constituency are just the perfect constituency in terms of ripe for the picking, so to speak. If you court this community, you are likely to receive their support if you do so effectively and you prioritize the issues they care about. We are not a voting bloc. And I think that it's wrong to sort of think about it that way. Arab Americans have historically been about a 3% Republican, a 3% Democrat, and a very strong, consistent a third independent. What we saw during the Bush administration post-Iraq war was a decline of Republicans in our community, and it shifted to Democrats. So it's not that independent numbers increased. We saw an increase in terms of Democratic votes. If you look at 2016, that is one of the highest ever Democratic numbers that we see here. 52% of Arab American voters identified in 2016 as Democrats, to a very, very significant drop of 26% for Republicans and a consistent 22% for independents. I honestly believe that we were looking at a response here to the campaign of 2016, which was pretty significant in its bigotry in many, many forms. We had a candidate announce that they would institute a Muslim ban. We had the kinds of things that we saw in terms of xenophobia across the board. There was a variety of factors that I think played into why there was what became, I think, a problem of identifying with the Republican Party. Now, this begs the question of why would you, after 4 years, we saw a 12-point we saw from 26 to 32% increase in terms of Democratic identification. And I think people looking at that might find that confusing, but to me, it was a leveling off of where this community generally is. And it is basically after these past few years of some pretty extraordinary political movements in our country, ones that continue to play out. Today, people were still willing to sort of say, okay, but I identify with the tax cuts and I identify with some of the social issues and kind of come home to the Republican Party. And interestingly, our poll was done in the first 2 weeks of October. When you looked at the election results nationally and you saw the gains for Republicans and state legislators and House seats and others, even though Trump himself did not get enough numbers to win, the Republicans did. And I think that you see in those numbers there. We always ask our community what their priority votes are. What their priority issues of concerns are. And this is kind of a funny thing because in addition to the assumptions people make about us, they think we're a single issue constituency. We are not and have never been. I say this to people all the time. If I were to vote on Palestinian human rights, I might never ever cast a ballot. So we have to necessarily focus on what are, and this is what we find when we conduct our polling, people regularly tell us jobs in the economy, healthcare, employment. Those tend to be what are always the top ranked issues. You will see here that solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict also is here. People think about it as, wow, that's really low for this. That's not necessarily true at all. When we ask our voters how, in polls in the past, we've asked how important is our Middle East issues to casting your vote, and 77% of the people roughly 70% of people will say it is very important. So there's a very real awareness that those issues are important, but at the end of the day, I care about my kids' school, I care about healthcare, it's the same exact thing. What is different this time around, and what I have to say made me really proud of our community about, you'll see here the #1 issue ranked is race relations in the United States. And that had not happened before. We've not had any issue that trumped jobs in the economy, healthcare, our education. So that was a pretty significant development. If you can take us, Netta, to the next one, tied to that, 70% of Arab Americans, when you look at that, said they had a very positive or somewhat positive view of the movement for Black lives. There is an understanding that there's a racial reckoning that's taking place in our country today, and Arab Americans connect to that in a very meaningful way. The next one is the final one I want to speak to, and that is when we asked about policing specifically. I don't think I gave that to you, so no problem at all. 39% of Arab Americans, so when we looked at 39% agreed to the following statement: policing in America is overly militarized and perpetuates systemic racism. That's pretty clear in terms of its positioning about needing reforms that would overhaul a system as opposed to the kind of incremental change that's there. So that's my spiel on the Arab American voter. I'm happy to sort of hear more and answer questions for our conversation. But thank you again for taking the time to join.
There are a couple of questions that have already been added to the chat, Maya, so I'm going to read those out to you. And if other people have questions, I encourage you to either add them to the chat or maybe raise your hand to ask yourself. This, Maya had mentioned earlier that she preferred this to be more of a discussion style. We really encourage you for participation in today's event. So our first question, Maya, is can you say a bit more about the participation of Arab Americans at the state and local levels?
Yeah, we had, we had about 65 candidates that we know of that were on the ballot on November 3rd. And this goes to the number that made it past their primaries. We had even more in terms of those who were who ran on the primary level. And they participated from, I mean, we've elected city council members, local school board members, 6 members of Congress. So when you talk about the engagement, it really is the full range that you would expect. In terms of what they did on the ground locally, with COVID, obviously the get out the vote efforts were changed. The good news for us as an institution is that about 2 years ago, we began a process where we engaged in what is called relational organizing. So we would use these tools that connect people through their own individual phones as opposed to the traditional phone banks or door-to-door efforts. And when COVID hit, I think for that reason, we were frankly a little bit better positioned to resort to that. So we had a lot of texting that went on during this campaign. And instead of me, the way it would typically work is I jump in, I get a list from the van, and I start calling that list, encouraging people to turn out. Our folks did do that across the country. They absolutely conducted those phone banks. But in addition to that, they used their cell phone as a really key organizing tool where we were organizing and connecting through the process our own individual contacts. So I would use my telephone to reach out to somebody that was not necessarily on the AI list, for example. And as you can imagine, it just would domino and continue in terms of its outreach. I called it the Kevin Bacon outreach method, but for anybody that still gets that, great. For not, whatever. But that was really instrumental. And then in the communities where our as I said, our numbers are concentrated enough, you had just wonderful turnout from our folks as poll workers, so that they were there to support voters who were needing perhaps English as a second language kind of assistance. We run a Yellow Vote as part of a program called Election Protection that's run by the Lawyers Committee, and we run the Yellow Vote hotline. It's the only Arabic English hotline that exists to assist voters, and that's what I got to do election day, and it was incredible. I spent my day fielding calls from people who, to give you a sense of the voter excitement, we got 2 calls from folks who said, I received a call saying I could vote, but I'm a green card holder. And I would be like, okay, I love the enthusiasm. I know you cannot vote yet. You have to become a naturalized citizen first. And it's just wonderful, because it really you did get the sense of how much folks were being pushed to participate in our democratic process. That's important. We also got things like a young man who voted in a in a polling place in Michigan, and he spent 2 hours helping other voters who needed translation but could not stay any longer. He literally said, my lunch hour is way over, I gotta go. So he called the hotline and said, there are voters in line here who need help, and there's nobody that can help them in terms of Arabic speakers. And we were able to then reach out to colleagues on the ground and say, this particular polling place needs some help, and this wonderful young man's got to go back to work, and boom, that happens. The level to which they did and organized on the local level is really something we can all be proud of.
And I want to get to the next question, but I also see Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins has joined us on the line. So I want to give her a few minutes to just say hello and sort of introduce herself.
Hi, I was on. I thought I would just show myself, particularly since Netta asked the question that I came in with. First of all, thank you for doing this. I'm Bonnie Jenkins, and I'm the executive director of WCAPS, and I'm so glad that the SWANA group was able to host this. So thank you, Netta and Christina, for doing this. Thank you for coming and speaking to us. I think this is very interesting. I have a couple other questions, but I'm going to wait till others chime in. And I'll just ask now, and you can answer later. This is great. And I just wonder, how do you maintain this enthusiasm? How do you make sure that, that this maintains? And I think that's probably true for a lot of people, but, these are great numbers, and, what happens in 4 years from now or 2 years from now? How do we keep it going? But thank you for doing this. Really, really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Ambassador Jenkins, and thank you for the wonderful organization that you have. I mean, I can't think of my work every single day is about empowerment, and the importance of empowering women in this particular space is incredibly critical. So I thank you for creating this wonderful entity, and for the amazing young Arab American women we have that are helping to lead it. The enthusiasm question is really central, and it really does go to this particular community. I find in some ways easier to organize because of that. We are issue driven. It is not a particularly strong party ID. There is a core that identifies as Democrat, a core that identifies as Republicans, but those independents, they're moved strongly by issues that they feel are going to most impact their lives and the issues that they care about. So as long as we maintain the conversation on issues, on policy, we can keep them engaged. The moment that this stuff becomes what we have all been seeing increasingly, the more that they are turned off by the process and say, I can't. I didn't talk about this, but one of the disinformation has been a huge problem. And I specifically use the term disinformation, not misinformation. Misinformation can just be a mistake. Disinformation is designed to suppress the vote. It is designed to keep voters like us away. 67% of Arab Americans we asked in this poll said that they were concerned about their vote counting. We've not encountered, first of all, we've never asked a question like that before, and we've not encountered that as an issue. Our political process has gotten to the point where voters literally question whether or not their vote would count. And we know we have the safest, most transparent voting. I mean, we all have problems. Democracy is not perfect, but we know we have the best process in place. And this process still managed to convince voters they should be worried about that. So we have a lot of work to do to maintaining the focus of our political process on basically how government and its policies can improve people's lives, as opposed to the partisanship. I made it clear we're nonpartisan, but I also can't pretend that's what's been happening isn't an anomaly. I am personally a Democrat. That's how I identify. It's where my work is. That's great, but I'm thrilled that I have Arab American Republicans who are engaged with the Republican Party, who make sure that the Republican platform, just like the Democratic platform, represents our community's values. None of that has been able to take place over the last 4 years. And what we're seeing play out in Georgia now among Republican officials saying, please stop threatening us for participating in the democratic process. Those are the kinds of things that are going to absolutely negatively impact enthusiasm for participating in the process, because you're a former ambassador, so you've had conversations with the world, and we're supposed to be setting a standard, and to be thinking that this is where our process is difficult to see.
Agree.
Thank you.
We had a few more questions, Maya. Somebody had asked if we have a breakdown of votes via gender. I don't know if that's a poll you take.
We do. I don't have the votes, but I do polling. via gender. And when Biden's numbers, if I recall correctly, were 60-some%, it was significantly higher among women. It was significantly higher among young people. It was significantly higher among those with degrees. So women tend to be, I'll leave it at that. They were even more supportive of Biden over Trump. Trump gained in our community, specifically among men.
Another question that was asked was about the vote in Florida. Somebody had mentioned that the only outreach they saw came from Muslim organizations rather than Arab organizations. I wondered if you had any feedback on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was some pretty significant engagement in the area of Jacksonville and other specific counties. The conflation piece, Florida's always been a little odd for us. Mgage is centered there, and Mgage does the Muslim outreach piece. And interestingly enough, when this occurred a few years back, it was actually a problem for us in that the Arab American surname list, which is a proprietary surname list that we created to identify Arab American voters. We run that against the regular voter list and then produce a list of Arab American voters. That sometimes ends up getting used by organizations that are also doing faith-based outreach. So there's a perception that it's happening a certain way, but it often is just honestly confuses the situation. The way I try to think about it is Florida played less of a key role this year, so there was less attention played to it, and unlike you saw in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. So that question to me means we have to do better for the midterms in Florida, and I'll make note of that, and thank you for raising it. But I also defer to, sometimes the idea that as long as you're getting a voter contact from any organization, any party, anything at all, that's a good thing, because it just encourages a voter to participate in the process.
Thanks. I wanted to ask a quick question, Maya. So I thought it was awesome to see the number of Arab Americans who are supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and those types of statements. I'm curious if you have plans or if you have thought about polling how Arab Americans feel about some other phrases like maybe defund the police, while we have a pretty large, moderate and independent voter base within Arab Americans around the country. I'd be curious to know how they feel about that.
Yeah, I would love to do that. The polling, as you can imagine, is expensive, and the ability to ask a certain number of questions is completely tied to that. I wanted to ask the piece about militarized and systemic racism. That to me was more important than the messaging of the defund but I would have, so the answer to your question is I would love to be able to ask it. It's just a question of limited bandwidth. So I did, like, for example, on the policing in America being militarized and systemic racism, that's 39%. The one that came in after that at 35% was policing in America needs to be reformed, but not radically. That's still pretty significant when you add 39 and 35. Only a small number thought that, antagonism towards the police is unfair and is the biggest problem. 13% of Arab Americans found that. That's, for a community, again, that can't be, it's a diverse community with diverse interests. I really did feel like that was pretty indicative of that. We have in the past, in fact, we didn't release these numbers, but we do ask the questions regarding internal discrimination that they've experienced. So there is a second part of this poll that we can share that highlights that, but we did not get into specifics about that language.
Awesome, that's really interesting. We got another question from someone who wants to know if you can speak a little bit about AAI's involvement in GOTV efforts in these Senate races in Georgia, and can you pull Arab American voters from your lists for Georgia Senate race volunteers?
Yeah, so we certainly could, but being a nonpartisan, we don't. But I will tell you that we have we have a wonderful community in Georgia. The Institute hosts a fall leadership summit every year, typically either in Washington or in Michigan, depending on whether or not how big the election is. In 2018, because of our field organizers who had established these wonderful relationships with this core community in Georgia, we hosted half of it in Michigan and the other half in Atlanta. And it was really pretty incredible. We had Congressman John Lewis who came, and he was supposed to spend 15 minutes with us, and he sat on that stage for over an hour, engaged in incredible conversation about anything from voting to civil rights movement. And because the community in Atlanta is so heavily Palestinian, the issue of Palestinian human rights was also really elevated strongly. So I know that group, and again, independent of us, I know they're organizing very heavily on this particular, these runoffs, and they are very much engaged. They work with the local group that Stacey Abrams had established. Those are relationships that have been in place now for years. So they've been part of this movement in Georgia for some time. So yes, the answer is I know they're engaged, but it's as a nonpartisan institution, it's independent of us.
I wondered, Maya, while more people add more questions to the chat, and thank you everyone, this has been so wonderful, and Maya especially, thank you, we're learning so much. I wondered if you could though provide a bit of context around why it's so difficult for us to get numbers around Arab Americans and sort of the issues with the census and how we're not counted, and why that sort of conflates a lot of these numbers and sort of those issues with that.
Yeah, so the good news on this is that the Census Bureau has been a partner in this effort for decades. They understand that there's a massive undercount of our community. The Arab American Institute is officially a partner with the Census Bureau as what's called a CIC, or a Census Information Center. So we have a contract in place. If you need demographic information about Arab Americans, you contact us and we provide it for you. So we do it all the time for researchers, journalists, any request that would come in. The problem is a really basic one of real estate on a form. There is no box that we can check that that gets an accurate count. And if without a box, it requires too much of that individual to do, frankly, to be able to get to an accurate count. There used to be something called the ancestry question on the long form of the census, when there used to be a long form of the census. For cost reasons, that was eliminated. And then you have the version that is used now. When the ancestry question went away, so did literally our ability to count our folks. And as a result, there has been this dramatic undercount. So what we have been pursuing is a new category that's called Middle East and North Africa. I want to be clear every time I say this, it is not about creating a quote unquote MENA identity. There is no MENA American. MENA is just a geography. It's just a section of the world. Middle East and North Africa, it's 22 members of the Arab League. So it's the 22 Arab nations plus 3. The 3 are Iran, Turkey, and Israel. What it would allow us to do is on the census form, there would be an additional box added that would say MENA. And within MENA, you then, it's, first time ever we've done this online, you'd have the ability to then identify, I happen to be Lebanese, so I would check off Lebanese. If I am Egyptian and Yemeni, I would check off Egyptian and Yemeni. What it allows us to do is, once that census is completed, we go into the back end and we pull all that, gave us Palestinian, Egyptian, Yemeni, Syrian, Lebanese, everything that allows us to get to the Arab American number. So it's, we would have had it for the 2020 census were it not for the politicization of the census this time around. The question was tested in 2015. The Census Bureau found that it did indeed improve the count of our community. And as statisticians whose simple objectives is to get to a better count, they recommended that it be added. And like I said, regrettably, this has been an unusual time. And therefore, it was not added this time around. I will tell you that our efforts on 2030 are already underway. We did not even wait for the post-enumeration period to end. We are already focused on making sure that happens. And the final point I would make is that there's a lot of confusion as to how people talk about it as we're not white, therefore we should not be listed as white. It is not a racial category. The MENA category would be an ethnic category. Arab Americans identify as white. Arab Americans identify as Black. Arab Americans identify as brown. We're a multiracial community, so it's not specific to pursuing a racial category. We're very much like the Hispanic community, where it's about identifying the national origin, ethnicity, and then it can be of any race.
Wonderful. And Bonnie, I know you had mentioned you had other questions, so I wondered if you wanted to ask your questions.
No, I think that Maya's actually answered the questions that I had. I mean, the census one is always an interesting one for me, particularly this year when they had these different rules about when it was going to end, and you know, they changed the dates and everything. And then that, of course, really educated me a lot on the issues with, you know, how you're counted and not counted. So I'm glad to hear that you're already starting on the next one.
Yeah.
But hopefully by 2030 gives us 10 years. So hopefully by 2030, you know, that'll be fixed on the census.
Well, one of the good things that happened during this process is it was so transparently bad in terms of how the Trump administration approached this. For example, they abandoned a category like MENA that had been tested, and then out of nowhere attempted to add a citizenship category that had not been tested and had not been on a census since 1950. So the political agenda that came to bear was clear in that. So as a result, you really did have people who said, okay, this is pretty transparent. They're trying to suppress the count. There's no question about that. So President-elect Biden is already on record. When I mentioned the Arab American platform that was put out by the campaign, that platform already advocates for support of a new MENA category. And obviously we hold all our elected officials to account, and that'll be one of the ones that we'll remind them of real soon, because it's crazy how quickly the 2030 process gets underway. And then the only other point I would make on the frustration of the census is we've never seen one like this, and to the detriment of hard to count communities across the country. We have a massive undercount in the Black community, a massive undercount in the Native American community, and when they tell you we got to 99.9%. So it sounds good. It sounds like, oh, like how bad can that be? That's horrible. They haven't, I don't want to get too technical on this, but they haven't deduped the areas where there is an increase that they would have to dedupe, and therefore they're not going to do that. And then you have hard to count areas where we simply never counted those people. You have group homes. It's been devastating.
Yeah. It was pretty bad this year. And I also wonder, and as you think about preparing for 2030, that there also be an education campaign attached to that about the census, because there's a lot of confusion about what the census is. There's a lot of disinformation and misinformation, but disinformation about it, and encouraging people of color not to sign or not to do it. And so I feel like this census, it just was so, I mean, COVID made it even more confusing. And so you couldn't have the normal people that go around and knock on the doors and ask people to do it. Because I was going to be one of those people, as I volunteered to walk around and get people to sign and fill it out. And they couldn't do that because of COVID. So it was a weird year anyway. But I think the Trump administration also made it a little more complicated, changing the dates. So, but hopefully in 2030, this will all be resolved. But I think we certainly want to have an education campaign attached to that as well, so people understand a little bit more what the census is and why it is, or why people may want to actually fill out those things.
Yeah, and then that's key. We did our focus groups for how to target the problem of Arab Americans not feeling particularly comfortable about governments gathering data about them in 2018. And that's what we used to inform the campaign that we created called Yalla Count Me In. We use Yalla for absolutely everything. It works. So the Yalla Count Me In campaign really ran for 2 years in the build up to April 1. And you're 100% right that we couldn't have predicted the pandemic and the impact that it would have. But the problems that we had in this particular census were not just about the pandemic. It was about a deliberate attempt to make sure that communities of color who would become the majority in 2040.
We did have a couple other questions enter the chat. I know myself and Christina have gotten a few. So I'm going to, I know we only have 15 minutes left, Maya, so we'll try to be quick, but somebody asked that for the possible MENA census category, do you think that those types of national identification attachments will maintain over generations? How attached or conscious are Arab Americans of their identities abroad?
It's a great question. And oddly enough, the way I'll answer it is to highlight what I just talked about. When we did focus groups on testing for messaging, which was phenomenal, by the way, because so we all know that the single largest and most shameful way in which census data was used in this country was the internment of the Japanese American community. That is the example that is upheld when you talk about government misuse of data. The one that comes second to that was post 9/11, when the Census Bureau shared data with the Department of Homeland Security about Arab Americans. I'm not equating the two. There's no question it's not the same, but it's a compromise of data. And when you talk to people about, and I'd say this all the time, $250,000 fine, up to 5 years in prison if anybody misuses your data. Well, that's one thing, right? But that's the thing about the census is we're talking about publicly available data that would be used. So when I thought the best way to do this, brilliant me, is to say, we just tell them up front that, you know, yes, the government has targeted our communities, but it's done so with publicly available data. Don't be afraid. And, you know, your roads, your schools, education, English as a second language program, the traffic light that you need, the stop sign, those are all more important. So I thought it was all about like just being completely transparent and seeing what happened. So we tested my messaging and it failed miserably, completely miserably. Like people wanted positive messaging. Like they wanted us to tell a story of Arab American communities and ethnic pride in our heritage. The ads that did the best were, you know, a jiddo with his granddaughter sitting on her lap, helping him fill out her census form. So it was like all of this like really wonderful messaging that was rooted in a real source of pride in being an Arab American. And what I thought was interesting in that is we went to upstate New York, which saw a huge increase in new refugees. And then we went to like a Peoria, Illinois, where you're on your third and fourth generation, or Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We want to make sure the community, as I said, when I say it's diverse, the majority are also born in this country. They're not immigrants, but we have this constant, wonderful influx of immigrants that make it a dynamic community. And when you do this testing, you have to do both. You cannot pretend one covers both. And it was so fascinating. The group in upstate New York, when you asked the questions about government intrusive use of data, they were like, the government can have anything it wants about me. Ask me anything at all, because obviously they've just gone through 2.5-year intensive vetting process before arriving in this country. But it was the folks in Baton Rouge and the folks in Peoria who were like, who really, if you think about it, in some ways don't have the same civil liberties concerns as those new arriving immigrants who also went. They're the ones who said, no, the government can't do this. And I really saw it as this strong connection to their Arab American identity, that, you know, the old adage, I'm in through the door and I close it behind me. That's not what you saw here. You really did see a community strongly identify and wanting to make sure that they protected the rights of those who came after them. So that part is significant. And then when we do our polling, we also ask the questions about how they most identify. And while, yes, religion plays a role and even country of origin will play a role, the Arab American continues to be the highest way that they identify. And to me, that reinforces this sense of feeling strongly about where they come from, generations removed.
Great. I love this conversation. I know Neda and I have talked a lot about having broader conversations about Arab Americans in the census. So I'd love to keep the conversation going at some point, but I do want to kind of circle back a little bit to Arab Americans on the campaign trail. We saw really outstanding numbers of an outstanding number of Arab Americans who were fundraising for the Biden-Harris campaign. When they put out the top fundraisers over $100,000, there were a number of Arab Americans on that list who played a big role in financing the campaign. And just kind of thinking back to the fact that not too long ago, Arab Americans weren't even able to give some money to a lot of these candidates, and now they're playing a massive role in fundraising. So I'm interested to hear kind of your perspective on that, and what benefit you see there for the future of Arab American political engagement.
Sure. So I'll answer it this way. I'm a huge proponent of campaign finance reform and wish deeply that our political system did not rely on huge bundlers. Having said that, I would say that we have been very good bundlers for a very long time. This is a community that does really well on the fundraising front and has historically. We just don't always connect it the same way to the kind of issue work and grassroots organizing piece that needs to happen. So the idea that there are Arab Americans who played a significant role in fundraising is not the anomaly. It's that we saw that this time around translate more into a presence as part of an official campaign in a way that's different. And I want to be clear on this point. I'm old, so I was here in the mid 90s. The Clinton-Gore campaign in 96 put out platforms for Arab Americans the same way that we saw this time around with Biden. It just was not as developed as the one that was done this time around, which is why people see this one as so groundbreaking. So I think it's wonderful. It's continued progress. And kudos for the bundlers, but more importantly, from my perspective, kudos for the advocates who have managed to connect the money to the policy.
Great, I definitely agree. I'm not sure if I see any other questions in the chat, Neda. I could be missing a couple because I'm not great at monitoring it. I don't want to skip anyone.
No, I think actually we've gotten to all the questions in the chat, and it's great because we have about 12 minutes left. So if anybody else has any other last questions, please feel free to raise your hands or to unmute yourself. I saw Saara, who is another member of our SWANA group, enter the room. So Saara, welcome. It's great to see all of the people here. If not, Maya, I would love to also, if you have any last words or last things you'd like to say. This has been just so enlightening for me, I'm sure for so many of us, and we're so grateful to have you here. So
I can talk forever about everything, so it's better to hear questions or comments from folks.
I don't know, maybe maybe you could give us some of your personal, as we come to an end, some of your personal thoughts about this election, you know, and you know, the voting and you know, how some of the question I asked before about how do we make sure this maintains in the future. I mean, what are your thoughts about this, your takeaways from all of this?
Yeah, you know, I'll answer it personally because you asked me a personal question. This election was my son's first voting election. He voted as a 17-year-old in the primary and voted as an 18-year-old in the general election. He ran for delegate. So as a 17-year-old, the first time he ever voted, his name was on the ballot. And he garnered 15,000 votes in his district. Didn't win, but that was, you know, first time I ever ran as a precinct delegate, I got 3 votes. So he kicked my butt with his 15,000 and I was thrilled. You know, it was a big, voting for me is always a really big deal. I'm an immigrant to this country, and I'm here as a product of the war in Lebanon. My family had moved to this country with the idea being that we would go back after things settled down. Things took 15 years to settle down, and my mother, Allah yarhamha, would say, once you drink the water in America, you don't drink any other water. It sounds better in Arabic, but the point is, you know, we stayed, and it's a real thing, this connection we have to our democratic process. I care deeply about people. As a result, I care deeply about issues that impact people. And as a result, democracy is really important to me. That is what I do. And to see this election through my son's eyes was really something. And I think as much as I was proud of what he had done, as much as I was proud, we did not vote by mail. We both went and voted together in person. We voted by mail during the primary because it was the height of COVID and you had to do it that way. So all the precautionary measures that we did, but we went and voted in person. And to see, I'm one of these people who said Trump would never win. And my kids were young at the time who were like, well, could we leave this country? And if we left because we're Muslim, is he not going to allow us in? And I'd be like, honey, you're an American citizen. This guy can't do anything and he's not going to win. Then he won the primary. And I was like, but he's not going to win the general. Then he won the general. And I'm like, but then Republicans are going to step in and do something. And I say, I'm talking in my personal capacity right now, not in my institutional voice. our system, I think, was set up to deal with a rogue element as the key executive branch. What it wasn't, I think, set up to deal with, another key branch of government not providing the oversight. And I think what you have in Mitch McConnell in particular, and what you have in the House Republican leadership is something that's really threatening where we are today in terms of how we're governing. I am concerned for people's safety when they're doing nothing other than counting ballots. Local election officials, Republicans and Democrats alike, have been threatened. What we saw happen in Michigan, I can't celebrate what happened in Michigan. I can't. There is, to see a 2-2 deadlock by certifying votes for Wayne County. Wayne County has the highest concentration of American voters in the entire country. And what they were looking at was not other cities in Wayne County. They wanted to disenfranchise the city of Detroit, which is 70% Black. So I can't sit back and say something happened where that alignment took place and they switched their votes and said 2-2 and it moved forward and then ended up with a 3-1 vote and we saved democracy. I don't think democracy is supposed to be contingent upon one person having the right moral conviction, right? I mean, we have to, this has opened up this problem that exists here in a way that's really alarming. So when I think about this election, and I'm still processing what's happening in this election, I am worried. And I teach my son to participate in the process to the point where he ran and he did it. But it's the integrity of the process itself is called into question right now.
So I know that we only have about 6 minutes left, but there was one more question that came through to Christina. So I'm gonna let her ask that and then we can sort of wrap things up.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to know, if you have this data, how many Arab Americans voted by mail versus in person. I'm not sure if you've collected that yet.
We did. Well, to be clear, it's forward-looking, not backward-looking. We don't do exit polling for the very reasons I began with in the beginning. Exit polling won't tell me anything other than a snapshot of those particular communities as opposed to national. How do you plan to vote in this election? In person on election day, 50% of voters. By mail was 33% of voters, and in person before election day was 16% of voters. So those were the numbers before election day.
Thank you.
And there's a raised hand I can see from Suzie Abdou. I don't know if how that works, but I see his hand.
Hi, everyone. Yes, it's Suzie. I'm sorry to be jumping on late, and I am driving, but was super excited about this call, and I'm a new member of WCAP, so thanks for organizing this. Maya, I have a question, and if you've already answered it, please, feel free. I can just listen to the recording. I'm Coptic, and we have a large diaspora here in Los Angeles. They're mostly Republican-leaning voters, but the ones that are Democrat have a hard time with, being referred to as like Arab Americans, right? We're not Arab, we're ethnically Coptic, and so on. These kind of divisions, I'm sure you know what happens with the Chaldeans and other groups. What is the messaging that you find is most effective to rally everyone behind Arab Americans? Like, this is the most effective way to move forward together politically.
Excellent.
And is that the right way to think? And is that the right way to even talk about it?
It absolutely is. That's a great question. I will answer it by saying I strongly believe that a person's individual identity is how they identify. So they should feel free to identify any way that they want to. Having said that, I will tell you that as the Arab American Institute, and this relates to our work around the census, we classify Chaldeans, Copts, Syrians, all falling under the Arab American umbrella. And that is because they are, whether it's a Coptic Christian in Egypt or a Chaldean Iraqi Christian from Iraq, that we believe that still falls under the Arab American identity. That's how we do the counting. Again, though, I want to be clear. I have the Assyrian community actually took down the AAI's website back in the 90s because of our work on, I shouldn't say the Assyrian community, some elements of the Assyrian communities were so unhappy with the way we were talking about that, they literally took down the website. So I understand it's a huge sensitivity. I will say in places like Michigan, and this is maybe the way that I think you can strike a balance, because our work is about Arab Americans and everybody falling within that. We have members of the Chaldean community who work very closely with us. They're members of our National Policy Council, so they identify as Arab Americans, but they also strongly identify as Chaldeans. So in a place like Michigan, where the numbers are concentrated as such, we'll absolutely talk about the Chaldean community the same way we might talk about Americans of Palestinian origin or others. So it's whether it's Copts, Chaldeans, Assyrians, those classifications within that are coded on the census. So just so you know, there's a code for Copts, and then that still gets placed under Arab American. So it just depends on how those folks want to identify. We've actually seen this, oddly enough, in the Somali American community. We've always included Somali Americans as Arab Americans. And with the election of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, that came up as well, where people were like, that, okay, now you want to include us because we got elected, but you're racism before. And it was like, we've always included Somali Americans, but again, those who identify are welcome to do so, and those who don't are welcome to not. But for us, it's really try to keep it as clear as possible, which is 22 members of the Arab League. And we strongly believe there are cultural pieces that sort of bring us together. But it is that, talk about a conversation one can have, that's the one that would be super interesting. So thank you, Suzie, for raising it. It's been, we have some wonderful elected officials actually from the state of Ohio who are from the Coptic community and who have been strongly associated with our work and feel comfortable identifying. So it really does go to people's individual preferences.
That's so interesting, and it's such an important question. And actually, Suzie, I'm glad you raised it, because I'm excited to let everybody know that in 2021, we will be doing our Difficult Conversation series, which the SWANA group is hosting. Part of it will be this issue of racism and colorism in the region, as well as in the community here at home. Another part of it will be about these cultural and country divides, especially given just the movement of borders, the movement of people, the colonization in the region, the ways identities have moved and shifted. It was already alluded to, but the minority groups that exist within the region that don't necessarily identify with the majority, as well as with the religious and other ethno-religious conflations. So these are definitely subjects that we will be speaking on. These will be coming in 2021. Please keep a lookout for that. Otherwise, Maya, I did want to give you a few minutes to close out, and then I think me and Christina can sort of give a little spiel and we can end there.
I just gratitude for the wonderful conversation, and I hope you invite me back to have the difficult stuff too, because that's the space I love to exist in. But thank you for everything that you all are doing. Thank you, Ambassador Jenkins, for taking the time to do us. Thanks, Christina and Netta, for hearing me out. I'm going to jump onto a transition call about domestic terrorism of all things. So I thank you all for taking the time to chat today.
It is such an honor to have you with us, Maya. I know for me and Christina, you are such an inspiration. And Christina, please go ahead, close us out.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Maya. Enjoy your next call.
Thanks, everyone.